Chapter 1. The Whispers Begin. The air in Blackwood Asylum smells of bleach and despair, a potent cocktail that clings to the back of my throat like a phantom hand. I arrived here 6 months ago, a voluntary admission, seeking solace from the relentless echoes that plagued my waking hours. They started subtly, whispers on the wind, the rustling of leaves forming coherent, albeit chilling, phrases. "You are not safe," they'd hiss, or "they are watching." I initially dismissed them as stress, the byproduct of a failing marriage and a stalled career. I was a historian, for God's sake, a rational man grounded in facts and evidence. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, weaving themselves into the fabric of reality until I couldn't distinguish between the real and the imagined. Blackwood, with its imposing Victorian architecture and reputation for cutting-edge, and occasionally ethically questionable psychiatric treatments, seemed like the best, perhaps the only option. Dr. Silas Thorne, the asylum's director, a man with eyes that gleamed with unnerving intensity, assured me that they could help me silence the voices, to reclaim my sanity. He was a pioneer in the field of auditory hallucinations, or so he claimed. He said that Blackwood's isolation, nestled deep in the Blackwood forest and surrounded by the imposing Blackwood Mountains, would be helpful to recovery. He claimed that the only way to recover from hearing voices is to be in complete isolation for some time. As Dr. Thorne led me through the cavernous halls, I felt a primal dread grip my chest. The flickering gaslights cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers, which had been relatively subdued during the intake process, began to swell once more. "Turn back," they urged, their voices a chorus of tortured souls. "This place is not what it seems." I tried to ignore them to focus on Dr. Thorne's reassuring smile, but the whispers were relentless, their insidious tendrils wrapping around my mind. He led me to my room cell rather. It had a bed, a desk, and a closet. There were no windows, only a thick steel door that promised security but felt like a tomb. Dr. Thorne told me I would be alone in this cell for 2 days. "Rest, my friend. You need rest. We will bring meals to you every 6 hours," he said. As soon as the door clanged shut, the whispers erupted into a cacophony of voices, each vying for my attention, each filled with chilling pronouncements. The room felt colder now, the air thick with an unseen presence. I tried to distract myself, to unpack my meager belongings, but the whispers wouldn't relent. They knew my name, my deepest fears, my darkest secrets. "Your wife," they hissed. "She knew, that's why she left." My heart pounded in my chest. My divorce was a sensitive subject, something I hadn't even discussed with Dr. Thorne. How could the voices know? I sank onto the bed, burying my face in my hands, desperate to escape the relentless onslaught of their pronouncements. I closed my eyes and covered my ears, but it was no use. The whispers were inside my head, an insidious infection that threatened to consume me. I spent the next 2 days in a state of near catatonic terror, barely eating, barely sleeping, tormented by the ceaseless whispers. They told me stories of Blackwood's dark history, of the inhumane experiments conducted within its walls, of the patients who had been driven mad by the asylum's sinister treatments. They spoke of a malevolent presence that permeated the very foundations of the building, a being that fed on fear and despair. The whispers mentioned something about old God, but I paid no attention to it. On the 3rd day, Dr. Thorne visited me, his smile as unnerving as ever. "How are you settling in, Mr. Davies?" he asked, his voice smooth and measured. "It's getting worse," I croaked, my throat raw from disuse. "The voices, they're relentless." "I understand," Dr. Thorne replied, his eyes gleaming with what I could only interpret as excitement. "But that's to be expected. It means the treatment is working. We're stirring things up, bringing the darkness to the surface." "Treatment?" I asked, my voice laced with skepticism. "What treatment? All I've done is sat in this cell and listened to those things." "Patience, Mr. Davies," Dr. Thorne said, his smile widening. "Everything in its time. Now I have a new therapy for you, something that will help us delve deeper into the source of your auditory challenges." He gestured to two orderlies standing behind him, their faces blank and expressionless. They stepped forward, their movements stiff and robotic. One of them carried a tray with a syringe. I didn't like this. Panic flared within me. I knew that voice. "What is that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Just a little something to relax you," Dr. Thorne said, his voice dripping with false reassurance. "It will help you open your mind to the possibilities." The orderlies advanced, their eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. I tried to scramble away to resist, but I was weak, exhausted, and utterly terrified. One of them grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. I heard a sound like a child's laughter deep in my head. "No," I screamed, my voice echoing through the cold, sterile chamber. "Get away from me." But it was no use. The needle pierced my skin and a burning sensation spread through my veins. The whispers intensified, growing louder, more insistent, their voices a deafening roar that threatened to shatter my mind. A final voice, louder than the others, screamed in my head, "You are ours now." I tried to fight it, to hold on to reality, but the darkness was closing in, swallowing me whole. The last thing I saw was Dr. Thorne's smiling face, his eyes gleaming with triumph. His lips moved, but his voice was drowned out by the chorus of voices that now possessed my mind. "Welcome home," they whispered. And then everything went black. Chapter 2. I awoke disoriented, my head throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. The room was the same cold, sterile cell, but something felt different. The whispers were gone. A blessed silence filled my mind, a silence so profound that it was almost deafening. I sat up in bed, my body stiff and sore. The memory of the injection was still vivid, the burning sensation in my veins, a lingering reminder of the terror I had experienced. I stood up and walked to the door, my legs unsteady beneath me. I pressed my ear against the cold steel, listening for any sign of life, but there was only silence. Had the treatment worked? Had Dr. Thorne actually managed to silence the voices? I dared to hope, to believe that I had finally found a path back to sanity. But a nagging feeling of unease persisted, a sense that something was not quite right. I waited, packing restlessly in the confines of my cell for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. The heavy steel door creaked open, and Dr. Thorne stood before me, his smile as unsettling as ever. "Ah, Mr. Davies," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "I see you're awake. How are you feeling?" "The voices are gone," I said, my voice filled with cautious optimism. "Did it work?" Dr. Thorne's smile widened, but there was a strange glint in his eyes, a hint of something darker lurking beneath the surface. "Indeed," he said, "the treatment was a resounding success. We have silenced the external influences that were plaguing your mind." "External influences?" I asked, my brow furrowing in confusion. "You mean the voices?" "Precisely," Dr. Thorne replied. "But now we must focus on integrating you back into society. We will start with some tests to measure your progress. Come with me." He led me out of the cell and down the long, echoing hallway. The asylum seemed different now, quieter, more sterile. The flickering gaslights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to follow us as we walked. I noticed that the other patients were gone. Usually the hallways were lined with them, but this time there was nobody. "Where is everyone?" I asked. "They are undergoing treatment," Dr. Thorne said, his voice carefully neutral. "We have implemented some new methods to improve the efficacy of our therapies." His words did little to assuage my growing sense of unease. There was something about his demeanor, his carefully controlled movements, his too-perfect smile, that set my teeth on edge. He led me to a small, sterile room with a single chair in the center. A complex array of wires and electrodes were attached to a machine that hummed with a low, ominous frequency. "Please sit down, Mr. Davies," Dr. Thorne said, gesturing to the chair. "This will only take a moment." I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to run to escape this place before it was too late. But I was trapped, caught in a web of my own desperation. I wanted to believe that Dr. Thorne was helping me, that this was all part of a legitimate treatment. I sat down in the chair, my heart pounding in my chest. "Now, Mr. Davies," Dr. Thorne said, his voice taking on a strange, hypnotic quality. "I want you to relax, to clear your mind. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I want you to answer them honestly, without hesitation." He began to attach the electrodes to my head, his touch cold and clinical. The humming of the machine grew louder, filling the room with a nauseating drone. "Are you experiencing any auditory hallucinations?" Dr. Thorne asked. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The voices are gone." "Are you experiencing any feelings of paranoia or anxiety?" "No," I said, my voice stronger now, more confident. "I feel calm, clear." "Do you trust me, Mr. Davies?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. I hesitated, my mind racing. Did I trust Dr. Thorne? Could I trust anyone in this place? "Yes," I said, my voice betraying my uncertainty. "I trust you." Dr. Thorne's smile widened, revealing a glimpse of something truly terrifying lurking beneath his carefully constructed facade. "Excellent, Mr. Davies," he said, his voice dripping with malevolent satisfaction. "Then you won't mind if we delve a little deeper, will you?" He reached for a dial on the machine, his eyes gleaming with an unholy light. I tried to pull away to escape, but it was too late. He twisted the dial, and a surge of electricity coursed through my body, sending me spiraling into a vortex of pain and madness. The whispers returned, louder than ever before, their voices a chorus of triumphant glee. "He is ours now," they screamed. "He belongs to the old god." And as the darkness closed in, I realized that I hadn't silenced the voices at all. I had merely become one of them. Chapter 3. The electricity surged through me, a searing pain that threatened to tear my mind apart. But amidst the agony I felt something else, a strange sense of integration. The whispers weren't just voices anymore. They were becoming a part of me, weaving themselves into my thoughts, my memories, my very being. It was as if my consciousness was expanding, merging with something ancient and malevolent. Dr. Thorne stood before me, his face contorted in a rictus of ecstatic delight. He muttered something unintelligible under his breath, his eyes fixed on the machine with an almost religious fervor. As the electricity subsided, I felt a strange calmness settle over me, a sense of detachment from the pain and the terror. I looked at Dr. Thorne, and for the first time I saw him clearly, not as a doctor, but as a vessel, an instrument of something far greater than himself. His addiction was the same addiction I was now starting to develop, an addiction to a higher power. "What have you done to me?" I asked, my voice sounding strangely hollow, as if it were coming from someone else. Dr. Thorne chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "I have opened your eyes, Mr. Davies," he said. "I have shown you the truth. You are now a part of the great work." "The great work?" I asked, my brow furrowing in confusion. "The awakening," Dr. Thorne replied, his eyes gleaming with fanaticism. "The return of the old god. We have been chosen, Mr. Davies, to prepare the way for his arrival, to cleanse the world of its impurities." His words were insane, the rantings of a madman. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw a conviction so absolute, so unwavering, that it shook me to my core. And as the whispers swirled within my mind, I felt a strange pull, a desire to believe, to surrender to the madness. Dr. Thorne released me from the chair, his touch surprisingly gentle. He led me out of the room and down the hallway, his pace brisk and purposeful. The asylum was even more deserted than before, the silence broken only by the sound of our footsteps. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice still sounding distant and detached. "To the heart of the matter," Dr. Thorne replied, "to the place where it all began." He led me to a section of the asylum I hadn't seen before, a dark, forgotten wing that reeked of decay and despair. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows deeper and more menacing. We reached a heavy oak door, its surface scarred and weathered, adorned with strange, unsettling symbols. "Beyond this door lies the truth, Mr. Davies," Dr. Thorne said, his voice hushed with reverence. "Are you ready to face it?" I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, to flee this place before it was too late. But the whispers urged me onward, their voices growing louder, more insistent. "Open the door," they commanded. "Embrace your destiny." I reached out and grasped the handle, my hand trembling. I took a deep breath and pulled the door open, revealing a long, dark corridor. At the end of the corridor, a single flickering candle cast an eerie glow on a stone altar. "Come, Mr. Davies," Dr. Thorne said, his voice beckoning me forward. "The old god awaits." I stepped into the corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked towards the altar, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Spread across the stone surface were the bodies of the other patients, their eyes wide with terror, their faces contorted in expressions of unimaginable agony. Their blood formed an intricate network of rivers and sigils. I turned to Dr. Thorne, my mind reeling in horror. "What is this?" I gasped. "What have you done?" Dr. Thorne smiled, his face radiating a terrifying blend of madness and religious ecstasy. "A sacrifice, Mr. Davies," he said. "A necessary sacrifice to appease the old god. And now," he produced a long, ornate knife from within his coat, "it is your turn to serve." He lunged, the knife glinting in the candlelight. I screamed, my voice echoing through the chamber of horrors, but it was too late. The knife plunged into my chest and the darkness closed in. This time the darkness did not consume me, but the whispers grew, and they consumed Thorne. Chapter 4. I didn't die. The knife went through me, but my life was not taken, and as I felt the blood draining from my body, I could see the light leave Dr. Thorne's eyes. The whispers I was now sharing were not my own. As Thorne's body fell to the floor, I kneeled and began chanting words I could not read, but I felt the old god's presence. I stood up and walked back the way I came. As I stepped into each room, I walked in and out. As I did this, the corpses stood up and followed me. Their movements were inhuman, and they each stared at me with a look of both terror and also longing. By the time I was back in my cell, I had accumulated over 100 corpses. I stood in the middle of the cell, and one by one each of them kneeled, and began chanting the same words I had uttered over Thorne's body. It was like they had become devoted to the old god, and to me. "We must escape," I said. My voice was not my own, but I knew what I had to do. This was not a request, but an instruction to my new horde. As soon as I spoke the words, the door slammed open. The asylum was different. I could hear the whispers now. The walls were starting to corrode. I could smell the decay and death. As I walked, the building was changing. "Where are we going, master?" asked one of the voices. It was a male corpse with a hole through his forehead. "To the old house, in Blackwood Forest, to my house. They are coming and we must prepare," I said. As we walked, each room corroded and the floors began to sink. There was no one left alive in the asylum, and the building itself was becoming something twisted. I could see now the architecture was unsettling. The rooms had no doors. The floors were slanted. This building was starting to mimic my psyche. As we left the asylum, the sky was a sickly green, the air thick and toxic. The Blackwood Forest, dark and imposing, loomed before us. I could feel the old god's presence growing stronger, guiding me towards my destiny. I knew there was no turning back. The fate of the world and mine was tied to this forest, to my old house, to the awakening of the old god. Chapter 5. The trek through Blackwood Forest was arduous, even for the animated corpses that followed my every step. The forest floor was a tangled mess of roots and decaying leaves, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. The branches of the ancient trees clawed at us like skeletal fingers, and the shadows danced with a life of their own. I had lived in this forest most of my life, but I had not felt the true evil until now. I was once lost to this forest, however. Now that I've been awoken to this, I can now see the true landscape. The forest was mirroring the landscape of my mind, and the minds of all the corpses around me. The trees were much taller than before, and the path we were following did not exist only a few days before, and the sounds of dripping water echoed around us. I did not know where the water was dripping from. The corpses moved with an unnatural grace, their movements fluid and silent. They seemed immune to the thorns and brambles that tore at my clothes and skin. They followed me without question, their eyes fixed on me with a mixture of fear and devotion. I could feel their thoughts, their desires, their utter subservience to my will. It was a strange sensation, empowering and disturbing in equal measure. "Master, we sense a presence," one of the corpses said, its voice a raspy whisper. "Something watches us from the trees." I stopped, my senses on high alert. I could feel it too, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a sense of being observed. The whispers swirled around me, warning me of danger. "Be vigilant," I said, my voice echoing through the forest. "We are not alone." The corpses spread out, their eyes scanning the trees, their bodies tensed for action. The forest held its breath, waiting. Then a twig snapped in the distance. The corpses turned towards the sound, their movements swift and deadly. A figure emerged from the shadows, a young woman with wild, tangled hair and eyes that burned with an unnerving intensity. She was dressed in rags, her body covered in dirt and grime. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice cautious. The woman stared at me, her eyes filled with hatred and fear. "You are defiling this forest," she said, her voice raspy and cracked. "You have awakened something that should have remained sleeping." "I am merely fulfilling my destiny," I said, my voice echoing with the power of the old god. "I have been chosen to prepare the way for his return." The woman spat on the ground, her eyes blazing with anger. "You are a fool," she said. "You have no idea what you are unleashing. This forest is ancient, sacred. It has been protecting us from the old god for centuries. You will doom us all." "I am beyond your threats," I said. "The old god is coming and nothing can stop him." I raised my hand and the corpses surged forward, their movements swift and brutal. The woman screamed, her voice echoing through the forest, but it was quickly silenced by the onslaught of the undead. They tore her apart limb from limb, their hunger for violence insatiable. I watched the carnage unfold, my heart filled with a strange mixture of horror and satisfaction. The woman was a threat, an obstacle to my destiny. Now she was gone. I turned and continued my trek through the forest, the corpses following close behind. The old god was growing closer, and I had a house to prepare. Chapter 6. My old house stood on a small clearing. The clearing was starting to show ritualistic symbols. Its structure was decaying in the woods. Even when I lived here, everything was eroding. Every day felt like a struggle to try and maintain the property and clean it. The house had absorbed my feelings and reflected them. It was a two-story Victorian, and it was falling apart, both a metaphorical and physical representation of my life, a mirror of my soul, a fractured house for a fractured mind. The paint was peeling, the roof was sagging, and the windows were boarded up, like empty eyes staring into the void. The garden, once a source of pride, was now overgrown with weeds and thorns, a testament to my neglect. This was the perfect location for the return of the old god. The clearing was also a graveyard. My family had been buried here for generations, their secrets and sins buried alongside them. As I walked through the gate, I could feel their presence, their whispers joining the chorus in my mind. They were excited. "Welcome home," they said. "It is time." The corpses began cleaning the yard, removing weeds and scrubbing the headstones. As the yard was cleaning, more and more ritualistic symbols were forming on the stones and on the ground. This was not my garden anymore. It belonged to the old god. I entered the house, the door creaking open with a mournful groan. The interior was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of decay and forgotten memories. The furniture was covered in sheets, the portraits on the walls faded and cracked. This house held generations of secrets, of pain, of madness. It was the perfect vessel for the old god. I began to prepare the house, instructing the corpses to clean, to repair, to prepare the altar. They worked with a tireless efficiency, their movements guided by my will, by the will of the old god. I found old books in the library. As I flicked through the pages, I realized this house was a library of the occult. As I opened one of the books, a map fell out. The map looked like my house, but it was a mirror image of my house, and the house was the Blackwood Asylum. I stared at the map, my mind reeling. The asylum, my house, were connected. They were two sides of the same coin, 2 points on a circle. I realized I was trapped. I could never escape Blackwood. It was a part of me, and I was a part of it. Everything in the house and in the asylum was linked to me and the old god. Chapter 7. Days turned into weeks, and the house slowly transformed from a decaying relic into a temple of the old god. The corpses worked tirelessly, cleaning, repairing, and decorating the interior with strange, unsettling symbols. The altar was moved to the center of the living room, adorned with bones, skulls, and other macabre artifacts. The garden was transformed into a ritualistic space, with standing stones, blood-soaked sigils, and a circle of gnarled, thorny trees. I spent my days studying the occult books I had found in the library, delving deeper and deeper into the lore of the old god. The whispers guided me, revealing hidden meanings, unlocking ancient secrets. I learned of the rituals, the sacrifices, the incantations needed to summon the old god into our world. The words that Thorn had said started to appear in my head more frequently. As I chanted, I was no longer myself. I was a vessel, an instrument of something far greater. My body was no longer my own. I was becoming one with the old god, and I was ready. One of the things I came across was about the town. I was not the first Davies to be a vessel. Generations ago, a Davies had almost completed the job. The house was a catalyst to bring the old god back, a place where rituals and power would thrive. The nights were the worst. I was still sleeping, but my dreams were not my own. I saw visions of a dark, terrifying entity, a being of immense power and unimaginable cruelty. It spoke to me in a language I didn't understand, its words echoing in my mind like thunder. It promised me power, glory, and dominion over the world. All I had to do was to complete the ritual. But there were times when the horror was too much to bear. Times when I longed for my old life, for the peace and quiet of my study, for the warmth of my wife's embrace. But those memories were fading, replaced by the growing darkness within me. I was losing myself, becoming a mere puppet of the old god. One night, as I stood in the garden, gazing at the moon, I heard a familiar voice calling my name. "David," it said. "David, can you hear me?" I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing in the shadows was my ex-wife, Sarah. She looked different, older, more worn. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and concern. "Sarah," I said, my voice trembling, "what are you doing here? This place is not safe." "I came to save you, David," she said. "I know what's happening to you. I know about the old god." "You can't save me," I said, my voice growing colder. "I have embraced my destiny. I am one with the old god." "No, David," she said, her eyes pleading with me. "You are not a monster. You are a good man. You can fight this. You can break free." Her words struck a chord within me, a spark of humanity that had been buried beneath the layers of madness and corruption. I looked at her, and for a moment I saw a glimmer of hope. But it was quickly extinguished by the rising tide of darkness. The whispers swelled around me, drowning out Sarah's voice, filling my mind with hatred and rage. "Kill her," they commanded. "She is a threat. She must be silenced." I looked at Sarah, and my heart filled with a cold, terrible resolve. She had to die. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. but it is too late. I am beyond saving. I raised my hand and the corpses surged forward, their movements swift and deadly. Sarah screamed, her voice echoing through the garden, but it was quickly silenced by the onslaught of the undead. They tore her apart limb by limb, their hunger for violence insatiable. I watched the carnage unfold, my heart filled with a cold, terrible satisfaction. Sarah was gone. She would no longer interfere with my destiny. The old god was coming and I was ready. Chapter 8. The night of the ritual arrived, bathed in the eerie glow of a full moon. The house was prepared, the altar adorned with the skulls of Sarah and Thorn, and the garden was transformed into a vortex of dark energy. The corpses stood in a circle around the altar, their eyes fixed on me, their bodies trembling with anticipation. I stood before the altar, dressed in a black robe, my face painted with strange, unsettling symbols. I held the ancient book in my hands, the whispers guiding me through the incantations. My power was growing stronger and stronger, and I knew that the old god was almost here. As I began to chant, the air grew heavy with a palpable sense of dread. The wind howled through the trees, the ground trembled beneath my feet, and the sky above opened up, revealing a glimpse of a dark, swirling abyss. As I was preparing and chanting, my original intention had changed. I was no longer simply a vessel for this old god. I now had the power. The more I channeled the spirits, the more I absorbed their hatred and their power, the more I was transforming. The whispers reached a crescendo, their voices merging into a single, deafening roar. The corpses began to writhe and moan, their bodies contorting in unnatural ways. And then it arrived. A dark, shadowy tendrils emerged from the abyss, slowly taking shape before my very eyes. It was a being of immense power and unimaginable terror, its form shifting and swirling like smoke. Its eyes burned with an unholy light, and its voice echoed in my mind like thunder. "I have come," it said. "I have answered your call." I knelt before it, my heart filled with a mixture of fear and awe. "Welcome, old god," I said. "I have prepared the way for your return." The old god fixed its gaze on me, its eyes piercing my soul. "You have done well, servant," it said. "Now you shall be rewarded." It reached out its hand, and a surge of dark energy coursed through my body. My muscles began to contort, my bones snapped, and my skin cracked and peeled. I screamed in agony, but my voice was drowned out by the triumphant roar of the old god. I was changing, transforming into something new, something terrible. My human form was dissolving, replaced by a grotesque parody of life. My skin turned black and leathery, my eyes glowed with an unholy light, and my teeth elongated into sharp, jagged fangs. As the transformation completed, I stood before the old god, no longer Davies but something else entirely. I was a monster, a servant of darkness, a harbinger of doom. "Now," the old god said, its voice echoing with malevolent glee, "let us begin." And with that the apocalypse began, as the dark entity's whispers echoed across the land and my own, merging with the monsters as its minions consumed the town. What followed became a symphony of chaos and despair, forever etched in the annals of Blackwood's dark history. The town was no more. Chapter 9. The world outside Blackwood had changed. The old god started spreading its influence across the land, turning others to its bidding. Many were like me. However, many were turned into new beasts. As I walked the earth spreading this influence, I started to have flashbacks to Thorn, and I started to become him. Did the old god want me to become him? What purpose did he serve? Why did he sacrifice himself to bring us together? I was starting to lose control, losing my mind, losing control of the old god's whispers. I sought guidance from my predecessors, the Davies who also became a vessel. However, when I visited their graves, I realized they were not vessels but victims. They had been tricked by the old god, to think they were vessels, but in reality they were used. I turned away from the graves, and as I did so, a book appeared in my hand. A spell book of how to defeat the old god. Chapter 10. To defeat the old god, its influence had to be diminished. The spell books talked about how to use runes to weaken its power. It talked about having to visit locations that were important to it and revering the power. As I was no longer Davies but some other creature, I still had Davies' soul inside me. I knew Blackwood Forest was first. I started carving ruins into the trees of the Blackwood Forest. As I did so, the trees began to die and rot. The old god became weaker. I could feel this. As I did this, I realized the forest was no longer reflecting my mind but the old god's. The more I destroyed, the more resistance I felt in doing so. The mind games were insane. What was reality? Chapter 11. I continued the ritual, placing sigils throughout the Blackwood area. Each sigil had to be placed in blood and reversed in the correct order. Blackwood Asylum, Blackwood Forest, and the graves in Blackwood. As I started to spread my word, I was no longer generating minions. People were turning against the word. The old god was pushing back. Whispering to my followers to kill me, I could feel them turn against me. I destroyed them all. Every person, every beast who turned against me was destroyed. As they died, they cursed me, and I could feel their power and essence get sucked back into the old god. This was a trap. I needed to find the heart of this power. Chapter 12. I needed help. There was no one I could trust. I started to remember Sarah and how she loved me. She understood the truth about the old god. I sought her grave. "Sarah, I need your help. Please guide me," I begged. As I did so, the ground started shaking. I looked around to see multiple graves have opened. Sarah was not the only one who knew the truth. The townspeople, all the townspeople who died, they wanted revenge on the old god. A war had begun, a war of the undead. Sarah stood before me. "David, you must destroy the house. It's corrupt," she said. "But if I destroy the house, where does the old god go?" I asked. "Into the abyss from whence it came. Trust me, David, the ritual must be reversed." I started to gather my army. We are going to war. Chapter 13. We marched from the graveyard, corpses who had been blessed against the old god. We marched on the house. As we approached the house, the sky turned black, the earth started to shake, and all the minions of the old god started charging us. They knew we were coming. My army fought valiantly, but they were simply not enough. As each person died, I could feel the old god getting stronger and stronger. I realized the only way was to channel the magic, destroy the book, and let the old god in. I stood and started chanting. The house began to corrode even faster, the sky turned even darker. A portal opened in the sky, and the old god reached for me. I stopped chanting, ripped open the book, and destroyed it. The old god screamed, but it was too late. The house was destroyed. I had severed the connection. The old god went back into its abyss, and I was free. Free to roam the world, free from Blackwood, free from the old god, free to be Davies again. But Thorn's whispers still existed in my head.